The mystery of the Dark Ages, what we actually lost. Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we're stepping into one of history's most misunderstood chapters, a period often painted in shadow and silence, where civilization supposedly stumbled and fell. But what if the darkness we imagine wasn't quite so dark? What if the story we've been told about the so-called Dark Ages is only half true? The years between roughly 476 and 1000 CE have been called many things. The Dark Ages, the early Middle Ages, a time of barbarism and ignorance. But as we look closer at what was actually lost, what quietly survived, and what slowly transformed in the aftermath of Rome's fall, we find something more nuanced than darkness. We find a world struggling to remember, working to preserve, and slowly building something new from the ruins of what came before. Tonight, we'll explore not just what vanished when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, but also the knowledge that slipped through fingers that couldn't hold it, the voices that were never recorded, and the technologies that faded not because they were forgotten, but because the world that needed them had changed. We'll look at what happened in the quiet scriptoriums of monasteries, in the bustling markets of Baghdad, and in the fields where peasants developed innovations that would feed Europe for centuries. This isn't a story of total collapse. It's a story about what happens when the lights dim, but don't go out entirely. It's about memory, survival, and the stubborn persistence of human knowledge. So settle in, let the world outside fade away, and let's walk together through these supposedly dark centuries to discover what was really lost, and what, against all odds, endured to fall into silence. The year is 476 CE. If you were standing in the Forum of Rome on that September day, you might not have noticed anything particularly dramatic. The marble columns still stood, weathered but proud. The aqueducts still carried water, though perhaps not as abundantly as before. The roads that connected the empire still stretched to distant horizons, though fewer travelers walked them now. But something fundamental had changed. The last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, a teenager with the ironically grand name Romulus Augustulus, had been deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. The imperial regalia, the symbols of Roman authority, were sent east to Constantinople. There would be no more emperors in the West. To understand what was lost in the centuries that followed, we need to understand what Rome had been. The empire at its height was more than just territory and military might. It was a vast, interconnected system of trade, governance, and culture. From the mist-shrouded forests of Britain to the sun-baked sands of North Africa, from the Atlantic coast to the Euphrates River, Rome had created something unprecedented. A single civilization spanning 1 million square miles. This civilization ran on infrastructure. The roads were engineering marvels, built with such precision that some remain in use today, more than 2,000 years later. They connected every corner of the empire, allowing armies to march, goods to travel, and ideas to spread. The aqueducts brought clean water from mountain springs to cities hundreds of miles away, feeding public baths, fountains, and the private homes of the wealthy. In Rome alone, 11 aqueducts delivered roughly 300 gallons of water per person per day, more than many modern cities provide. The cities themselves were centers of culture and commerce. They had public libraries where citizens could read works of philosophy, history, and literature. They had schools where children learned to read and write in Latin, the common language that united the empire. They had markets where you could buy silk from China, spices from India, and wine from Gaul. They had public baths where people gathered not just to bathe, but to socialize, conduct business, and exchange news. And then, slowly at first but with gathering momentum, it began to unravel. The causes of Rome's fall have been debated for centuries. Some point to economic troubles, the debasement of currency, and crushing taxation. Others highlight military problems, the empire's inability to defend its vast borders against wave after wave of migrating peoples. Still others focus on political instability, the endless cycle of civil wars and short-lived emperors. The reality, most historians now agree, was a combination of all these factors, compounded by environmental disasters like pandemic disease and climate change. But whatever the causes, the effects were unmistakable. Trade networks that had functioned for centuries broke down. Cities that had thrived for generations began to shrink as people fled to the countryside. The centralized administration that had governed the empire collapsed, leaving a patchwork of local rulers and warlords. And with the breakdown of the system came a dramatic decline in literacy and learning. Here's where the story of loss truly begins. In the Roman world, literacy was never universal, but it was widespread enough to sustain a vibrant literary culture. Estimates suggest that perhaps 20 to 30% of urban Romans could read and write. But literacy requires infrastructure to maintain it. It needs schools, teachers, books, and above all, a reason to be literate, whether that's for business, government service, or personal enrichment. As cities shrank and trade declined, as the machinery of government ground to a halt, all of these disappeared. By the year 600, perhaps one person in 100 in Western Europe could read and write. And most of those who were clergy, monks who learned their letters so they could read scripture and perform church services. This decline in literacy had profound consequences. In the Roman world, stone inscriptions announced new laws, commemorated the dead, and celebrated the achievements of emperors. After the 5th century, these inscriptions become increasingly rare and crude. The skilled stone carvers who could incise elegant Latin letters were dying out, their craft unneeded in a world that was forgetting how to read. The production of books, those precious vessels of knowledge, slowed to a trickle. In the 4th century, Rome had dozens of libraries. By the end of the 5th, there were fewer than 30. Books require not just literacy, but resources, animal skins for parchment, inks, and above all, the painstaking labor scribes who could copy text by hand. In a world where survival was uncertain and resources were scarce, book production became a luxury few could afford, and so text began to vanish. Not all at once, not in some dramatic burning of libraries, though that happened too. More often, books simply weren't copied. They wore out from use, were damaged by fire or water, were eaten by insects, or molded away in neglected storerooms. Each book that disappeared without being copied took its knowledge with it into oblivion. But the silence that fell over Europe after Rome's collapse wasn't complete. History didn't end. People didn't forget everything and start over from scratch. What happened was more subtle. The great empire-wide conversations of the Roman world, conducted through letters and books and traveling scholars, fell silent. In their place arose hundreds of smaller, local conversations. Knowledge became fragmented, scattered into isolated pockets. In one monastery, monks might preserve Virgil's poetry. In another, they kept the agricultural treatises of Columella. In a third, they treasured a medical text by Galen. But these islands of learning were increasingly isolated from each other. The bridges that had connected them, the roads and trade routes in common language, were crumbling. This is what made the period dark to historians. Not that nothing happened, but that we have so few written records of what did happen. The centuries between 500 and 800 are shadowy because the people living through them wrote less, and much of what they did right didn't survive. Entire generations lived and died without leaving their names in a historical record. Their stories, their struggles, their small triumphs and quiet sorrows are lost to us forever. But even in this relative darkness, lights continue to burn. In monasteries scattered across Europe, monks worked by candlelight, copying manuscripts and preserving fragments of the classical world. In Constantinople, the eastern half of the Roman Empire endured, keeping Greek learning alive. And in the rising Islamic world, from Baghdad to Cordoba, scholars were not just preserving ancient knowledge, but building upon it, creating new sciences and philosophies. The fall into silence was real, but it was never absolute. And to understand what was truly lost, we first need to understand what survived. Lost knowledge, myth versus reality. There's a popular story about the Dark Ages that goes something like this. When Rome fell, all knowledge was lost. The great libraries burned. Scientific learning vanished overnight. For 1,000 years, Europe wallowed in ignorance and superstition until the Renaissance rediscovered the wisdom of the ancients and rescued humanity from darkness. It's a compelling narrative. It's also largely wrong. The truth is more complicated and, in its own way, more interesting. Yes, knowledge was lost, sometimes catastrophically, but much also survived, often in unexpected places and unexpected forms. To understand what really happened, we need to separate the myths from reality. Let's start with what was actually lost. Roman concrete is perhaps the most famous example of a lost technology. The Romans developed a remarkable building material, a mixture of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater that could set underwater and actually grew stronger over time. The Pantheon's massive dome, still standing after 2,000 years, was built with this concrete. So were the harbor installations that allowed Roman ships to dock at ports across the Mediterranean. But after the fall of the Western Empire, the recipe for this concrete was forgotten in the West. Medieval builders still constructed impressive structures, magnificent cathedrals that pushed the boundaries of what stone could do. But they didn't have the Romans' ability to pour massive concrete structures. It wasn't until the 19th century that engineers rediscovered how to make concrete that could approach Roman quality. Why was this knowledge lost? Not because of some catastrophic event, but because it it was no longer needed. The large-scale public building projects that required Roman concrete, the harbors and bath complexes and massive temples, weren't being built anymore. Without a use of the knowledge, without master builders training apprentices in the old techniques, the expertise simply faded away. The same pattern repeats across many technologies. The Romans had sophisticated glass-blowing techniques that allowed them to create everything from window panes to delicate drinking vessels. They had advanced metalworking that produced tools and weapons of impressive quality. They had an understanding of hydraulics that let them build elaborate fountains and water organs. All of these techniques declined or were simplified in the centuries after Rome's fall. Glass production continued, but the quality dropped significantly. Most buildings no longer had glazed windows. Metalworking became less sophisticated. The great public waterworks fell into disrepair. But here's the crucial point. These things weren't completely forgotten. The knowledge persisted, often in reduced or modified forms. Medieval craftsmen still worked with glass and metal. They still built water mills and actually improved upon Roman designs. What was lost was not the fundamental knowledge, but the scale and sophistication of its application. Medical knowledge followed a similar pattern. The ancient Greeks and Romans had developed a substantial body of medical learning. Physicians like Hippocrates and Galen had written extensively about anatomy, disease, and treatment. Their texts describe hundreds of medicinal plants and their uses. They had performed surgeries, set broken bones, and even attempted cataract operations. Much of this medical knowledge did decline in Western Europe after Rome's fall. The complex medical schools of the Roman period disappeared. The sophisticated pharmaceutical preparations became simpler. Without the resources to support professional physicians, medical care became more rudimentary. But the knowledge didn't vanish entirely. It survived in several forms. Monasteries kept medical texts and maintained infirmaries where monks practiced basic medicine. Folk healers, often women, preserved herbal remedies passed down through oral tradition. And crucially, much of Greek medical knowledge was preserved in the Byzantine Empire and later translated and expanded upon by Islamic scholars. This brings us to one of the most important points about lost knowledge. Often it wasn't so much lost as relocated. While Western Europe struggled through the 5th and 6th centuries, other parts of the world were flourishing. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the old Roman world, continued to thrive with its capital at Constantinople. The city was a glittering metropolis, home to hundreds of thousands of people, with libraries full of Greek texts. Byzantine scholars read Plato and Aristotle, studied Euclid's geometry, and pondered the medical works of Galen. They didn't just preserve these texts. They continued to study and comment on them, keeping alive a tradition of classical learning that would eventually make its way back to the West. Even more remarkable was the explosion of learning in the Islamic world. Beginning in the 7th century, Arab armies swept out of the Arabian Peninsula and within a century had created an empire stretching from Spain to India. This Islamic empire became a crucible of learning, a place where Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese knowledge came together and fused into something new. In Baghdad, the Abbasid caliphs established the House of Wisdom in the early 9th century. This was not just a library, but a research institute and translation center. Scholars from across the Islamic world, Muslims, Christians, and Jews working side by side, translated Greek texts into Arabic. They didn't just translate, they studied, debated, and expanded upon what they read. The works of Aristotle, which had largely vanished from Western Europe, were carefully preserved in Arabic translations. The medical texts of Galen were not only copied but corrected and expanded with new observations. Greek mathematical works were built upon, with Islamic mathematicians developing algebra and making crucial advances in trigonometry and geometry. Indian numerals, including the concept of zero, were adopted and transmitted westward, eventually becoming the Arabic numerals we use today. Islamic scholars didn't just preserve ancient knowledge, they created new science. Al-Khwarizmi revolutionized mathematics. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote a medical encyclopedia that would be used in European universities for centuries. Alhazen made groundbreaking discoveries in optics. These weren't Dark Age scholars struggling to remember the past. These were cutting-edge scientists pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. So when we talk about knowledge being lost during the Dark Ages, we need to be specific. Lost to whom? Lost where? A text that was gone from Western Europe might be thriving in Constantinople or Baghdad. A technique that had vanished in Italy might be perfectly preserved in Syria. The real loss, then, wasn't so much in knowledge itself, but of access to that knowledge. Western Europe, fragmented and struggling, was cut off from the great libraries and learning centers of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. The texts existed, but they might as well not have for a peasant in Francia or a monk in Ireland who could never hope to see them. This isolation began to break down slowly, particularly after the year 1000. The Crusades, for all their violence and tragedy, opened channels of contact between Western Europe and the East. Spanish cities that had been under Islamic rule fell to Christian kingdoms, and their libraries full of Arabic texts fell with them. Translation schools, like the famous one at Toledo, worked to render Arabic texts into Latin, bringing Islamic science and philosophy, along with the Greek works preserved in Arabic, back to the West. What returned to Europe wasn't quite what had left. The Greeks' philosophical texts came back, filtered through centuries of Islamic commentary. Medical knowledge came back, enhanced with centuries of additional observation and experiment. Mathematics came back transformed, with new concepts and techniques that the Greeks had never imagined. But other knowledge truly was lost, and lost forever. We know from references in surviving texts that hundreds of Greek and Roman works once existed, but are now gone. We have titles, sometimes brief descriptions, but the texts themselves are lost. Historians estimate that perhaps 90% of ancient Greek literature has vanished. We have only 7 of the more than 100 plays that the tragic playwright Sophocles wrote. We have fragments of the pre-Socratic philosophers, tantalizing hints of lost arguments and theories. These losses happened gradually, over centuries. Each time a manuscript wasn't copied, each time a library was abandoned or burned, more works disappeared. Some were lost because they were seen as dangerous or heretical by Christian authorities. Pagan religious texts, for instance, often weren't preserved, but many more were lost simply through neglect and chance. A fire here, water damage there, an old manuscript that crumbled before anyone thought to copy it, and then there's knowledge that was never written down in the first place. The Romans had engineers who could design aqueducts and roads, but they didn't write detailed technical manuals explaining every step of the process. Much of their knowledge was practical, passed from master to apprentice through demonstration and practice. When that chain of transmission was broken, when there were no longer massive building projects employing hundreds of skilled workers, that practical knowledge faded. The same was true of countless crafts and techniques. We know Roman dyers could produce a stunning array of colors, but the exact recipes for many dyes are lost. We know they had impressive agricultural practices, but many details are missing from the texts that survive. The everyday, practical knowledge of how people actually did things, that was often never recorded, and so could never be recovered. What we're left with is a picture of selective loss. High literature, philosophy, and the works that educated Romans valued were more likely to be copied and preserved. Technical manuals, practical guides, and the voices of ordinary people were more likely to vanish. The knowledge we lost tells us as much about what literate Romans chose to value and preserve as it does about what was actually known. The myth of the Dark Ages says that all knowledge was lost and had to be painfully rebuilt from scratch. The reality is that knowledge moved, transformed, and sometimes vanished, but threads of continuity persisted throughout. The real darkness lies not in what was forgotten, but in what was never recorded in the first place. Vanishing voices. In all our talk of lost books and forgotten techniques, it's easy to overlook the greatest loss of all, the voices of ordinary people. When we study the ancient world, we see it almost entirely through the eyes of the elite, the literate, educated men who wrote the texts that survived. But they were a tiny minority. For every Cicero writing eloquent letters, there were thousands of farmers, craftsmen, servants, and slaves whose stories were never recorded. This problem becomes even more acute after Rome's fall. With the collapse of literacy, the vast majority of people in early medieval Europe left no written trace of their existence at all. They were born, lived, and died without anyone writing down their names. Their thoughts, their loves, their struggles, all vanished like breath on a winter morning. We can catch glimpses of them sometimes, shadows in documents that survive, a name in a monastery's land records, a skeleton in an archaeological excavation, a tiny detail in a saint's life that mentions, almost in passing, some ordinary person who happened to cross paths with a holy man being commemorated. But these are fragments, hints of lives we can never fully recover. Consider the women of the early Middle Ages. In the Roman world, women were already largely excluded from public life and formal education, but wealthy women could be literate, could commission works of art, could even occasionally make their voices heard. In the centuries after Rome's fall, even these limited opportunities largely disappeared. We know almost nothing about how ordinary women experienced the transformation of the Roman world into medieval Europe. What did a woman in 6th century Gaul think about as she went about her day? What stories did she tell her children? What songs did she sing? What did she hope for, fear, dream about? The historical record is almost entirely silent. And yet, women were there, living their lives, making crucial contributions to their communities. Archaeological evidence shows that women in this period worked as farmers, as traders, as skilled craftwomen. Some women wielded significant power, either as queens or as abbesses of wealthy monasteries. But their inner lives, their thoughts and feelings, are almost entirely lost to us. The same is true of peasant farmers, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population. These were the people who grew the food, who cleared the forest, who actually built the new medieval world with their hands. But we know almost nothing about how they saw their own lives. We can reconstruct, from archaeological evidence and later documents, what their lives were probably like. They lived in simple houses, often just 1 or 2 rooms, with earthen floors and thatched roofs. They worked dawn to dusk farming their lord's land in their own small plots, growing wheat and barley, raising pigs and chickens. Their diet was monotonous, bread and porridge and beans, with meat only on feast days. They faced constant threats: crop failure and famine, disease, violence from raiders or petty lords. But knowing what their lives looked like from the outside isn't the same as knowing what they felt. Did they find beauty in the changing seasons? Did they take pride in their work? What did they think about when they lay awake at night? We simply don't know. The oral traditions that surely existed in these communities are also lost. People who couldn't read or write still told stories, sang songs, passed down knowledge through speech and memory. But without writing, these traditions were fragile. They could change rapidly from generation to generation. And once they died out, they were gone forever, leaving no trace. We know that different regions developed their own distinct cultures in the wake of Rome's collapse. The Franks in Gaul, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, the Visigoths in Spain, each had their own languages, customs, and traditions. But the details of how ordinary people lived within these cultures, what they believed about the world, how they understood their place in it, much of this is permanently lost. Even entire cultures can vanish from the historical record, leaving only the faintest traces. Small ethnic groups, local traditions, minority religions, all could disappear entirely if no literate person bothered to write about them. Or they might survive only in distorted form, described by hostile observers who misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented what they saw. The loss of these voices has profound implications for how we understand the past. When we read about the Dark Ages, we're almost always reading about kings and bishops, about battles and theological controversies. But this was a tiny slice of reality. The vast majority of people were living entirely different lives, concerned with entirely different problems, and their perspective is simply gone. This is why the greatest loss of the period after Rome's fall might not be any particular text or technology, but perspective itself. The rich, complex, varied texture of human life, as experienced by millions of ordinary people, has been reduced to silence. We can imagine their lives, but we can never really know them. Modern historians have tried to recover some of these lost voices through careful analysis of surviving evidence. Archaeological excavations can tell us about material culture, about what people ate and wore and used. Legal documents sometimes preserve details about ordinary people's property disputes or crimes. Church records mention baptisms, marriages, and deaths. But these scraps of information, valuable as they are, can never fully reconstruct the lived experience of people who left no written record of their thoughts. We can know that a woman named Bertrada lived in a certain village in the year 650, but we can't know what she thought about her life, whether she was happy or sad, what she loved or feared. And there's another dimension to this loss that's worth considering: the loss of alternative worldviews. The people who lived in the centuries after Rome's fall had ways of understanding the world that were quite different from either classical Roman culture or later medieval Christianity. But because literacy was increasingly concentrated among Christian clergy, it's the Christian worldview that dominates our sources. Did ordinary people really believe all the things the church taught? Probably not consistently or completely. Folk beliefs, old traditions, local customs, all persisted alongside and interwoven with Christianity. But because these folk beliefs weren't written down systematically, we can only catch glimpses of them, often in documents written by clerics who condemned them as superstition. Imagine how different our understanding of the period would be if we had diaries from peasant farmers, letters between traders, songs popular in village festivals. We would see a world that was probably more diverse, more complex, more contradictory than the one that comes through in the official records written by the educated elite. This loss matters not just for historians trying to understand the past, but for anyone interested in the full range of human experience. Every voice that's lost is a unique perspective on what it means to be human that we can never recover. Every story untold, every song unsung, every thought unrecorded represents a small diminishment of our collective memory. The silence that settled over Europe after Rome's fall wasn't just the silence of fewer books being written. It was a silence of millions of people whose lives left no trace, whose experiences were never deemed worthy of being recorded. And in that silence, we've lost not just information, but humanity in all its messy, complicated, beautiful diversity. This is perhaps the truest darkness of the Dark Ages. Not that knowledge was lost, but that so many people lived and died without their stories being told. The peasant who developed a better way to plow a field, the woman who knew the healing properties of 100 plants, the craftsman who created beautiful objects with skill passed down through generations, all of them contributed to human civilization. But their names and their stories are gone, and with them, a piece of what it meant to be alive in those centuries has vanished forever. Technology that went backwards. One of the most striking things about the centuries after Rome's fall is that certain technologies genuinely regressed. This wasn't universal or absolute, and it didn't happen overnight, but there's no denying that some capabilities were lost and wouldn't be recovered for centuries. Understanding what was lost and why tells us much about how civilizations rise and fall. Let's start with the most visible loss: large-scale construction. The Romans were master builders. They erected structures that still inspire awe today. The Colosseum, the Pantheon, the great baths of Caracalla. They built bridges that spanned wide rivers, aqueducts that carried water across valleys, and harbors that could accommodate hundreds of ships. These weren't just impressive feats of engineering. They demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mathematics, material science, and project management. Building the Colosseum required organizing thousands of workers, coordinating the delivery of massive quantities of stone and concrete, and solving complex structural problems. After Rome's fall, construction on this scale simply stopped in Western Europe. The last great Roman building projects in the West date to the 5th century. After that, for several hundred years, no one built anything comparable. The great cathedrals of the High Middle Ages wouldn't rise until the 11th and 12th centuries, and while they were architectural marvels in their own right, they represented a different kind of knowledge, solving different problems. This loss wasn't because people forgot how to build. Medieval builders still constructed impressive stone churches, castles, and manor houses, but they didn't have the organizational capacity for projects on the Roman scale. They didn't have a centralized authority that could mobilize resources across vast territories. And they didn't have the economic surplus that such projects required. Consider what it took to build a Roman aqueduct. You needed engineers who could survey the land and calculate gradients with precision, since the water had to flow downhill from source to city, but not too steeply. You needed stone cutters who could shape massive blocks to exact specifications. You needed hundreds or thousands of laborers. You needed supply chains to bring materials from quarries. And you needed the wealth to pay for all of it. In a fragmented world after Rome's collapse, gathering these resources became impossible. Political authority was localized, wealth was scarce, and the sophisticated economic networks that had supported Roman building projects had broken down. So the knowledge of how to build aqueducts survived in texts, but the practical ability to actually build them vanished for centuries. The same pattern appears in urban infrastructure more broadly. Roman cities had amenities that wouldn't be matched again until the modern era. Public water supplies, sewage systems, paved streets, public baths. A Roman citizen in a major city had access to running water, could bathe in heated pools, and lived on streets that were regularly cleaned. By the 7th century, much of this infrastructure had collapsed. The aqueducts that supplied cities with water fell into disrepair or were deliberately destroyed in sieges. The elaborate drainage systems clogged up. The public baths, expensive to heat and maintain, closed. Streets that had been paved with stone became muddy tracks. London provides a stark example. In Roman times, Londinium was a bustling city of perhaps 30,000 people, with a forum, amphitheater, public baths, and a defensive wall. After the Romans withdrew from Britain in the 5th century, the city was largely abandoned. When the Anglo-Saxons eventually resettled the area, they actually avoided the old Roman buildings, regarding them with suspicion. For centuries, this area that had been a thriving Roman city was mostly empty, its grand structures slowly crumbling. When London began to grow again in the medieval period, it was as a very different kind of settlement. No aqueducts, no public baths, no drainage system. Houses were built of wood rather than stone, with thatched roofs rather than tiles. The streets were narrow and unpaved. It would take centuries before London would again approach the level of urban amenity it had known under the Romans. This regression in urban infrastructure had real consequences for people's health and quality of life. Roman cities, for all their problems, had public health advantages that medieval towns lacked. Access to clean water, sewage systems that remove waste, and public baths all reduced the spread of disease. Medieval towns, by contrast, were often filthy and disease-ridden. The technology of warfare also regressed in some ways, though advanced in others. Roman armies were highly organized, disciplined forces with standardized equipment and sophisticated logistics. A Roman legion could march vast distances, supplied by a complex network of granaries and supply depots. Roman soldiers wore segmented plate armor and carried large rectangular shields. They fought in tight formations, using tactics refined over centuries. In the centuries after Rome's fall, armies became smaller and less organized. The professional soldiers of the Roman legions gave way to war bands of warriors who often provided their own equipment. Armor became less sophisticated, shields smaller. Pitched battles between large, organized armies became rarer, replaced by raids and skirmishes. It wasn't until the High Middle Ages that European warfare would again match Roman levels of organization and scale. And by then, it had evolved in different directions. The mounted knight in full-plate armor, the longbow, and eventually gunpowder weapons represented not a return to Roman military technology, but something new. Yet it's important not to overstate these regressions. Technology didn't go backwards across the board. In many areas, it continued to advance, or advance in new directions that diverged from Roman patterns. Agriculture is perhaps the best example. Roman farming, while productive, was relatively static. The same basic techniques were used for centuries. Scratch plows that broke the surface of the soil, two-field crop rotation that left half the land fallow each year, oxen as the primary draft animals. In the early medieval period, farming began to change in ways that would eventually prove revolutionary. The heavy moldboard plow, which cut deeper and turned the soil over, came into wider use. This allowed farmers to cultivate the heavy, clay soils of northern Europe, opening vast new areas to agriculture. The three-field rotation system, which left only a third of the land fallow, increased productivity, and the development of the horse collar allowed horses to be used for plowing, since they could pull harder without choking. These innovations didn't happen overnight, and their spread was gradual. But by the year 1000, they had transformed European agriculture, allowing for larger populations and greater food surpluses. The medieval agricultural revolution set the stage for the population growth and economic expansion of the High Middle Ages. Similarly, water mill technology advanced significantly in the early medieval period. The Romans had water mills, but they were relatively simple and not widely used. By the 11th century, mills were ubiquitous across Europe, and their designs had become more sophisticated. They were used not just for grinding grain, but for a variety of industrial purposes. Fulling cloth, sawing wood, powering forge hammers. The windmill, unknown to the Romans, appeared in Europe by the 12th century. This was a significant innovation, allowing power to be generated in areas without suitable water sources. Wind and water mills were, in effect, the first engines, the first machines that could multiply human labor. They represented a level of mechanical sophistication that the Romans had never achieved. So the picture we get is complex. Some technologies regressed, particularly those requiring large-scale organization and resources. The capacity to build great public works, to maintain elaborate urban infrastructure, to field large professional armies, all diminished in the centuries after Rome's fall. But other technologies advanced, particularly those suited to the decentralized agrarian world that emerged from Rome's ruins. Farming improved, local craftsmanship, freed from a mass production ethos of Roman workshops, sometimes achieved remarkable quality. New techniques for working leather, weaving cloth, and forging iron appeared. The key insight is that technological change isn't always linear. It doesn't always move in one direction. Technologies can be lost when the conditions that made them useful or possible change. And new technologies can emerge that represent not a return to past glories but genuine innovation, solving new problems in new ways. What the early medieval period lost in grand, centralized technological achievements, it sometimes gained in small-scale innovation and adaptation. The world that emerged was in many ways poorer and less sophisticated than the Roman Empire at its height. But it was also, in its own way, creative and inventive, slowly building the foundations for the technological advances of the later Middle Ages and beyond. The regression, then, was real but partial, temporary but significant, and understanding it helps us appreciate both what was lost and what against the odds, was preserved or newly created. A world rebuilding in the dark. If we've been painting a picture of decline and loss, it's time to look at the other side of the story. Because even in the darkest centuries, even when cities shrank and learning contracted, the work of preservation and slow rebuilding continued. In monasteries and scriptoria, in royal courts and village workshops, people were laying the foundations for the cultural flowering that would eventually be called the Renaissance. The monasteries are where we need to start. As the Roman world crumbled, a new institution was rising to take its place: Christian monasticism. Beginning in the 3rd and 4th centuries with hermits who retreated to the desert to pray, the monastic movement evolved into communities of men and women living together under religious rules. By the 6th century, when Benedict of Nursia wrote his famous rule, monasticism had become a major force in European life. Benedict's rule, which emphasized regular prayer, manual labor, and hospitality to strangers, became the foundation for Western monasticism. Benedictine monasteries spread across Europe, often in remote locations far from the troubled cities. These monasteries became islands of literacy in an increasingly illiterate world. Monks needed to read to perform their religious duties, to recite the Psalms and read scripture during services. And once you have a literate community, you need books. So monasteries became centers of book production, with scriptoria where monks labored over manuscripts, copying them letter by letter. This work was painstaking and slow. A single manuscript might take months or even years to complete. The scribe sat at a desk, quill in hand, carefully copying from an exemplar. Each page had to be ruled to keep the lines straight. The text had to be copied without error, a difficult task given that the scribe might not fully understand what he was copying, especially if it was in Greek or technical Latin. Yet this work, patient and unglamorous as it was, saved much of what we know about the ancient world. Without the monks toiling in scriptoria across Europe, many classical texts would have vanished entirely. Every copy of Virgil's Aeneid, every manuscript of Augustine's Confessions, every version of Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy that we have today descends from copies made by medieval monks. The monks didn't just copy Christian texts. They also preserved works of pagan antiquity. This might seem surprising, since early Christianity was often hostile to pagan learning. But medieval monks recognized that the classics had value, both for their eloquent Latin style and for their content. Monasteries became repositories not just of scripture, but of poetry, philosophy, history, and science. The monastery at Monte Cassino, founded by Benedict himself, became one of the great intellectual centers of early medieval Europe. Its library held hundreds of manuscripts, carefully cataloged and preserved. The monastery at Bobbio in northern Italy, founded by the Irish missionary Columbanus, had a scriptorium that produced beautiful illuminated manuscripts, their pages decorated with intricate patterns and brilliant colors. Ireland deserves special mention in this story. While Roman Britain collapsed into chaos after the legions withdrew, Ireland, which had never been part of the Roman Empire, was becoming Christianized. Irish monasteries became remarkable centers of learning, preserving not just Latin texts, but also teaching Greek at a time when knowledge of that language was rare in Western Europe. Irish monks were passionate scholars and teachers. They developed a distinctive style of manuscript illumination, producing works of breathtaking beauty, like the Book of Kells. They also became missionaries, traveling to the continent to found new monasteries and spread learning. Irish monks established influential monasteries at places like Luxeuil in France and St. Gall in Switzerland. These Irish missionaries brought books with them, introducing classical texts to areas where they had been forgotten. They trained local scribes in the art of manuscript production. They established schools where young men could learn to read and write. In doing so, they helped preserve and transmit learning during some of the darkest decades of the Dark Ages. But the work of preservation wasn't just happening in Western Europe. As we've mentioned, the Byzantine Empire in the East was flourishing. Constantinople was a city of unparalleled wealth and sophistication, home to the greatest library in the Christian world. Byzantine scholars didn't just preserve Greek texts. They studied them intensively. They wrote commentaries on Plato and Aristotle. They copied and studied scientific works on mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. They maintained schools where students received a classical education in rhetoric, philosophy, and literature. This Byzantine preservation of Greek learning would prove crucial when the Crusades opened channels of communication between Western Europe and the Byzantine world. Greek texts could flow westward. And when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, Byzantine scholars fled west, bringing their precious manuscript with them and helping to ignite the Italian Renaissance. The Islamic world was even more active in preserving and expanding upon ancient learning. As Arab armies conquered the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain, they encountered the intellectual heritage of the Greeks, Persians, and Indians. Rather than destroying this learning, they embraced it. The translation movement in Baghdad was extraordinary. Scholars translated Greek philosophical and scientific works into Arabic. They translated Persian and Indian texts on mathematics and astronomy. They created Arabic versions of medical texts by Galen and Hippocrates. These weren't just rote translations. The translators often added commentary and explanation, making the texts more accessible. Building on this foundation, Islamic scholars made remarkable advances. In mathematics, they developed algebra, a word that comes from the Arabic al-jabr. They made crucial advances in trigonometry and geometry. They refined the astrolabe, an instrument for measuring the positions of stars and planets. They made detailed astronomical observations and created accurate star charts. In medicine, Islamic physicians went beyond Greek texts to conduct their own research. They described new diseases, developed new treatments, and performed sophisticated surgeries. The Persian physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine, an encyclopedic medical text that synthesized Greek medicine with Islamic innovations. It would be used as a textbook in European medical schools well into the 17th century. Islamic scholars also preserved and commented on Greek philosophy. They studied Aristotle intensively, writing commentaries that would later influence Christian theologians like Thomas Aquinas. They translated Plato's dialogues and kept alive the tradition of Greek philosophical inquiry. The Great Library at Córdoba in Islamic Spain held hundreds of thousands of volumes, making it one of the largest libraries in the world. Islamic Spain became a bridge between the Islamic East and Christian West, a place where knowledge could cross cultural boundaries. So while Western Europe struggled through the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, the work of preserving and advancing knowledge continued elsewhere. And eventually, that knowledge would flow back to the West, enriching medieval European culture. But preservation wasn't the only thing happening. New forms of learning and culture were emerging, suited to the new world that was being born from Rome's ashes. One crucial development was the evolution of vernacular literature. In the Roman world, serious literature was written in Latin, but as Latin became a language known only to educated clergy, oral traditions in local languages flourished. The Anglo-Saxons in England developed a rich poetic tradition, composing epics like Beowulf that told stories of heroes and monsters. These poems were composed orally, passed down through generations of poets who memorized and recited them. Eventually, some were written down by literate monks, preserving them for us to read today. Similar traditions developed across Europe. The Norse sagas preserved stories of Viking explorers and warriors. The Irish developed a rich mythological tradition. In Spain, epic poems celebrated the deeds of Christian knights fighting against Muslim rulers. These vernacular literatures weren't just entertainment. They preserved cultural memory, transmitted values, and helped forge new identities in emerging medieval kingdoms. They showed that cultural creativity didn't die with the fall of Rome. It simply took new forms. Education, too, was being reinvented. Without the Roman schools, new institutions emerged. Cathedral schools, attached to the seats of bishops, trained boys for careers in the church. These schools taught the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, along with theology and music for church services. In the Carolingian period, the 8th and 9th centuries, Charlemagne actively promoted learning. He invited scholars from across Europe to his court, including the English monk Alcuin, who helped establish a palace school. Charlemagne issued decrees requiring monasteries and cathedrals to maintain schools. This Carolingian Renaissance, as it's called, saw a flourishing of learning and culture. Charlemagne's scribes developed a new, clear handwriting style called Carolingian minuscule that made texts easier to read and copy. Scholars at his court copied classical texts, composed poetry, and studied theology. It was a deliberate attempt to revive learning after centuries of decline. The Carolingian Renaissance didn't last. Its gains eroded by new waves of invasions by Vikings, Magyars, and Muslims. But it demonstrated that even in the supposedly dark centuries, periods of cultural flowering were possible. Meanwhile, in the villages and fields, ordinary people were developing innovations that would reshape European life. The agricultural advances we mentioned earlier, the heavy plow and three-field rotation, spread gradually from farm to farm. They weren't invented by learned scholars, but by practical farmers experimenting with better ways to grow crops. Similarly, craftsmen were developing new techniques and tools. The blacksmith's forge became more sophisticated, allowing for better control of temperature and the production of higher quality iron and steel. Weavers developed improved looms. Potters created better kilns. These developments were incremental and local, the work of countless unnamed innovators. But cumulatively, they mattered. They made life a bit easier, a bit more productive. They laid the groundwork for the economic expansion that would transform Europe in the High Middle Ages. Even in matters of governance, new forms were emerging. The Roman Empire had been centralized, with power flowing from the emperor down through a bureaucratic hierarchy. The early medieval world was much more fragmented, with power dispersed among local lords. But this decentralization had its own logic. Lords owed loyalty to kings, but they also had responsibilities to protect their people and administer justice. The feudal system that emerged, for all its inequities, created bonds of mutual obligation that held society together during turbulent times. And institutions were developing that would eventually limit monarchical power. The idea that kings should consult with their nobles before making important decisions was taking root. In England, this would eventually lead to Magna Carta and the beginnings of parliamentary government. These were small seeds, but from them would grow new forms of political organization. The church, too, was developing as an institution. The papacy in Rome, having survived the empire's collapse, gradually asserted authority over Western Christendom. Monasteries formed networks, with daughter houses owing allegiance to mother houses. Bishops organized into hierarchies, with archbishops overseeing their fellow bishops. This created a parallel structure of authority alongside secular kingdoms. And because the church valued learning, it became a force for preserving and promoting education. The medieval church had many flaws, but its commitment to literacy and learning helped ensure that knowledge didn't entirely die out. So the picture we get of the early medieval period is one of slow rebuilding. The grand structures of Roman civilization were gone, but new forms were emerging in their place. Monasteries preserved texts and promoted learning. Vernacular cultures created new literatures. Farmers and craftsmen innovated. Political and religious institutions evolved. It was a process that took centuries. Progress was uneven, often interrupted by new disasters. But the trajectory was upward. By the year 1000, Europe was poised for a remarkable transformation. The population was growing. New lands were being brought under cultivation. Trade was expanding. Cities were being founded. The High Middle Ages would see an explosion of cathedral building, university founding, philosophical speculation, and technological innovation. And all of this was built on the foundations laid during the supposedly dark centuries. The monks copying manuscripts by candlelight in their cold scriptoria couldn't have known that their patient work would help make the Renaissance possible. The farmers experimented with new plowing techniques, couldn't have known they were setting the stage for population growth that would transform Europe. But that's what they were doing, slowly, incrementally, building something new from the ruins of what had been lost. The weight of memory. As we near the end of our journey through these shadowy centuries, it's worth pausing to consider a different kind of loss. The loss of memory itself and the burden of what's remembered. History is always selective. Even in times of abundant documentation, what gets recorded, what gets preserved, and what gets remembered is shaped by human choices. But in the early medieval period, when writing was scarce and books were precious, these choices had enormous weight. Consider what was chosen for preservation in monastic libraries. Religious texts were the priority, scriptures and the works of church fathers. Classical texts that were seen as useful for education, or that could be interpreted as compatible with Christian teaching, were likely to be copied. Works that seemed dangerous or worthless were allowed to fade away. This means that the vision of the classical world we've inherited is filtered through medieval Christian sensibilities. We have Virgil's Aeneid because medieval monks saw it as morally improving poetry. We have Aristotle's philosophy because it could be reconciled with Christian theology. We don't have much ancient erotic poetry or texts that celebrated pagan religious practices because these were seen as inappropriate. The same selective memory applies to how medieval people understood their own history. The written accounts we have of events in the 6th or 7th centuries were often written down centuries later, based on oral tradition and shaped by the concerns of the time of writing. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for instance, one of our main sources for early English history, was compiled starting in the 9th century, describing events that had occurred centuries earlier. How accurate was the oral tradition it drew on? How much its stories changed in the retelling? We can't know for certain. This creates a kind of uncertainty about the past. We know that things happened, that people lived and acted, but the details are murky, contested, impossible to pin down with certainty. The Dark Ages are dark not just because less was written, but because even what was written is often unreliable. Yet memory, even uncertain memory, has power. The stories medieval people told about their past shaped their present. The legends of King Arthur, based perhaps on some 5th or 6th century Romano-British leader, grew in the telling until Arthur became the ideal king, the model of chivalry and justice. The legend was more powerful than the historical reality. Similarly, the memory of Rome itself became a powerful force in medieval culture. Rome had fallen, its empire was gone, but the idea of Rome persisted. Medieval kings claimed to be continuing Roman traditions. The Holy Roman Empire, founded by Charlemagne in 800, was an explicit attempt to revive Roman imperial authority. This memory of Rome was often idealized, bearing little resemblance to the actual historical empire, but it gave medieval people a connection to the past, a sense that they were part of a continuous civilization stretching back to antiquity, and it inspired them to preserve Roman texts, to study Roman law, to build in the Roman style when they could. The tension between loss and memory is poignant. So much was lost, irretrievably gone. The voices of millions, the knowledge of generations, works of genius that were never copied. But what was remembered, even imperfectly, had profound effects. The medieval world was built on a foundation of selective memory, on fragments preserved and stories retold. And perhaps there's a lesson in that for us. We, too, make choices about what to remember and what to forget. We, too, preserve some things and let others fade. The archive we create of our own time will be partial, shaped by our values and concerns. The people of the early medieval period didn't set out to lose knowledge. They preserved what they could, what seemed important to them. But their choices determined what would reach us across the gulf of 14 centuries. And our choices will determine what reaches the people of the long dawn. As we approach the year 1000, the darkness that had settled over Europe after Rome's fall was slowly lifting. The 9th and 10th centuries had been difficult, marked by new waves of invasions. Vikings from the north, Magyars from the east, Muslims raiding from the south. But these threats were gradually contained, and a new stability was emerging. The population of Europe, which had declined dramatically in the 6th and 7th centuries, was growing again. New lands were being cleared for agriculture. Villages were expanding, and in some areas, new towns were being founded. Trade, which had contracted the local markets, was beginning to reach out again across longer distances. The climate was changing too. The medieval warm period, as it's now called, brought milder temperatures to Europe. Growing seasons lengthened. Crops that couldn't survive in the colder centuries before could now thrive. This agricultural abundance supported population growth and economic expansion. New technologies were spreading. The watermill and the windmill multiplied human labor. The heavy plow made farming more productive. The three-field rotation system meant more land under cultivation. Improved horse collars and horseshoes allowed horses to work more efficiently. In architecture, new techniques were being developed. The Romanesque style, with its thick walls, round arches, and barrel vaults, produced churches that were larger and more impressive than anything built in centuries. These churches weren't as large as the great Roman buildings, but they showed growing ambition and capability. And then, in the 11th century, something remarkable happened. Europe exploded with creative energy. Population soared. New cities were founded and old ones expanded. Trade networks stretched across Europe and beyond, reaching to Byzantium and the Islamic world. New universities were established in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, creating institutions dedicated to learning that would shape Western intellectual life for centuries. The Crusades, beginning in 1096, opened Europe to influences from the East. Crusaders and pilgrims traveled to the Holy Land, encountering Byzantine and Islamic cultures. They brought back not just spices and silk, but books and ideas. The translation schools in Spain worked to render Arabic texts into Latin, bringing Greek philosophy and Islamic science to European scholars. In the 12th century, Gothic architecture emerged, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with stone. The great cathedrals of Chartres, Notre Dame de Paris, and Canterbury reached toward heaven with soaring arches and vast windows of colored glass. These were not just buildings, but statements of ambition and faith, showing that European civilization had fully recovered from the crisis of Rome's fall. Philosophy and theology flourished. Scholars like Peter Abelard and Thomas Aquinas engaged with the newly rediscovered works of Aristotle, creating sophisticated philosophical systems that try to reconcile reason with faith. Universities became centers of debate and learning, training lawyers, physicians, and theologians. Literature thrived. Dante's Divine Comedy, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, all showed vernacular languages coming into their own as vehicles for sophisticated literature. Latin remained the language of scholarship, but the living languages of Europe were becoming literary languages too. Technology continued to advance. Mechanical clocks, spectacles, and eventually the printing press would transform daily life. The compass and improvements in ship design made long ocean voyages possible, setting the stage for the age of exploration. This flowering, which we call the High Middle Ages and eventually the Renaissance, was built on the foundations laid during the so-called Dark Ages. The monks who had preserved texts, the farmers who had improved agricultural techniques, the craftsmen who had kept skills alive, all had contributed to making this rebirth possible. The classical past hadn't been fully recovered. Much had been permanently lost. But what survived had been enough. The threads of continuity, thin as they sometimes were, had held. And medieval civilization, while different from Rome, had its own achievements and glories. Looking back from our vantage point in the 21st century, we can see the Dark Ages more clearly than the people living through them could. We can see that it was a period of transformation, not just decline. The world that emerged from Rome's ruins was poorer in some ways, but was also creative and adaptive. The people of the early medieval period faced enormous challenges: political fragmentation, economic collapse, invasions, disease, the breakdown of systems that had sustained civilization for centuries. Yet they persevered. They preserved what they could pass, while adapting to new realities. They built new institutions, developed new technologies, created new cultures. The losses were real and often tragic. Knowledge vanished, skills were forgotten, voices were silenced. But total collapse was avoided. Civilization, battered and diminished, survived, and eventually it not only recovered but surpassed what had been lost. What the darkness teaches. Now, in the quiet of this late hour, with our journey through the Dark Ages nearing its end, let's reflect on what this period teaches us. The first lesson is about fragility. Civilizations that seem solid and permanent can crumble with shocking speed. The Roman Empire had stood for centuries, had weathered crises before, had seemed eternal, and yet it fell. Within a few generations, much of what Rome had built had vanished or fallen into ruin. This should humble us. Our own civilization, with all its technological marvels and global reach, is not immune to collapse. The systems we depend on, the knowledge we take for granted, could be lost. Nothing is truly permanent. But the second lesson is about resilience. Even after Rome fell, even after literacy declined and cities shrank, civilization persisted. People continued to farm, to trade, to create, to think. They preserved what they could and built new things from the ruins. Human creativity and adaptability are powerful forces. The third lesson is about the importance of institutions for preserving knowledge. The monasteries, with their libraries and scriptoria, were crucial in keeping learning alive. In our own time, libraries, universities, museums, and archives serve similar functions. They are not luxuries but necessities, the guardians of our collective memory. The fourth lesson is about the selectivity of memory. What we choose to preserve, what we value and protect, shapes what future generations will know about us. The monks chose to copy religious texts and some classical works, but let others fade. Every generation makes similar choices, consciously or not. We should be thoughtful about what we preserve and why. The fifth lesson is about the danger of simplistic narratives. The Dark Ages narrative of total collapse and barbarism is too simple. The reality was more nuanced, with loss in some areas and continuity or even progress in others. When we study any historical period, we should be wary of oversimplification. The sixth lesson is about the global nature of knowledge. While Western Europe struggled, learning thrived in Byzantium and the Islamic world. Knowledge preserved there eventually made its way back to Europe, enriching medieval culture. In our interconnected world, we should remember that knowledge can come from anywhere and cultural exchange is valuable. The seventh lesson is about the long view of history. The Dark Ages lasted, depending on how you count, 300 to 500 years. That's a very long time in human terms. Many generations. But from the perspective of the full sweep of history, it was a transitional period between the ancient world and the medieval. Sometimes it takes centuries for civilizations to transform. The eighth and perhaps most important lesson is about loss. We will never know what was in the 90% of Greek literature that has vanished. We will never hear the voices of the millions of ordinary people who lived and died without leaving written records. This should make us value what we have and think about what we might be losing in our own time without realizing it. Are there perspectives being lost today because they're not being recorded? Are there forms of knowledge fading because we don't value them? Are there voices being silenced that future generations will wish they could hear? These are questions worth pondering. The mystery remains. As we come to the end of our exploration, the mystery we set out to investigate remains, in some ways, unsolved. We've learned what was lost and what survived. We've seen how knowledge was preserved in monasteries and Islamic libraries, how some technologies vanished while others advanced, how millions of voices fell silent. But the deepest mystery of the Dark Ages isn't really about what was lost. It's about the experience of living through that loss. What did it feel like to see the world you knew crumbling? What did a person in 5th century Rome think as the aqueducts ran dry and the markets emptied? What did a monk in 7th century Ireland feel as he carefully copied a manuscript of Virgil, preserving words from a civilization that had vanished? We can imagine, but we can never truly know. That lived experience is lost to us. Perhaps the greatest loss of all. The Dark Ages were not dark because nothing existed. They were dark because so little was recorded. The silence in the historical record doesn't mean life stopped or that nothing happened. It means that we can't see clearly what occurred. The darkness is in our knowledge, not in the past itself. Millions of people lived through those centuries. They loved, hoped, feared, struggled, celebrated. They raised children, planted crops, built homes, told stories. They had their own concerns, their own joys and sorrows. They didn't know they were living in the Dark Ages. To them, it was just life. And perhaps that's the final lesson. Every age is a present to the people living through it, not a past or a transition. The people of the early medieval period weren't living in the shadow of Rome's fall, mourning what had been lost. They were living their lives, dealing with their problems, building their world. We look back and see loss. They looked forward and saw possibility. We see darkness. They saw the world as it was, the only world they knew. History is always written from the perspective of those who came after, shaped by their concerns and values. The Dark Ages are dark because Renaissance scholars, looking back, saw them as dark compared to the classical world they admired. But the people living through those centuries didn't experience them that way. They experienced challenge, certainly, hardship, often, but also life with all its complexity. The mystery of the Dark Ages, then, is not just what was lost, but what it meant to live through that loss, to build something new on uncertain foundations, to carry forward what could be saved while letting go of what couldn't. It's the mystery of resilience, adaptation, and survival. And in contemplating that mystery, perhaps we can find something relevant to our own time. We, too, live in an age of transition, with old certainties crumbling and new realities emerging. We, too, face the challenge of preserving what's valuable while adapting to change. We, too, wonder what will be lost and what will survive. The people of the Dark Ages couldn't see the future. They didn't know that their patient work of preservation would make the Renaissance possible. They didn't know that the seeds they planted would flower centuries later. We can't see our future either. We don't know what will endure and what will fade. But we can learn from their example. We can value knowledge and work to preserve it. We can adapt to changing circumstances. We can build with patience, knowing that the work of civilization is never finished, that each generation must do its part. The lights dimmed after Rome fell, but they never went entirely out. In monasteries and villages, in royal courts and humble workshops, people kept the flame alive. They passed it to the next generation, who passed it to the next, until eventually the darkness lifted and a new dawn came. That's the real story of the Dark Ages. Not darkness, but endurance. Not loss, but stubborn survival. Not the end, but a long transition to something new. A quiet ending. So we come to the end of our journey through these mysterious centuries. We've walked through the ruins of Roman cities, sat in candlelit scriptoria, watching monks copy ancient texts, stood in the fields with peasant farmers developing new ways to work the land. We've seen what was lost and what survived, what was forgotten and what was transformed. The Dark Ages remain mysterious in many ways. We'll never recover what was lost. We'll never hear those silenced voices. We'll never fully understand the experience of living through civilization's collapse and slow rebuilding. But we've learned that the darkness was never total, that knowledge persisted, often in unexpected places, that people continue to think, create, and innovate even in difficult times, that civilization, once established, is remarkably difficult to completely erase. We've also learned that what we call loss is often more complicated than it first appears. Knowledge that vanished in one place might survive elsewhere. Technologies that were lost might be replaced by different, but equally valuable innovations. The past that was forgotten might be reimagined in ways that prove more useful than accurate memory. And we've learned that history is not a simple story of progress or decline, but something more complex. Periods of loss and periods of growth interweave. What ends in one place might be beginning in another. The darkness in one region might coincide with brilliance elsewhere. As you drift towards sleep tonight, or simply let your mind wander, you might think about those centuries, so far removed from our own experience yet still shaping our world. The books on your shelf are there because monks copied them. The calendar on your wall descends from medieval reforms. The universities that educated so many owe their existence to medieval innovations. The Dark Ages weren't simply a gap between Rome and the Renaissance, a period to hurry through on the way to more interesting times. They were centuries of human experience, of loss and preservation, of collapse and rebuilding. They matter not just for what came after, but in themselves, for the people who lived through them and the choices they made. Thank you for spending this time exploring these mysterious centuries with me. If you enjoyed this journey through the past, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe to Dreamy Hours for more explorations of history's quiet corners and forgotten stories. Your support helps us continue making these videos, diving deep into the past to find the stories that deserve to be told. Until next time, sleep well, dream well, and remember, even in the darkest times, the light of knowledge never entirely goes out. Someone, somewhere, is always keeping the flame alive, passing it forward to the next generation. Good night.